Chapter 2. A lone loon called across the lake. Its haunting cry echoed through the valley before fading into the endless forest. Another answered somewhere far beyond the mist. Then silence returned. Tim slowly opened his eyes. For a moment he simply listened. The gentle rustle of pine branches. The soft breathing of his family. The occasional pop from yesterday's dying campfire. Nothing else. He smiled. This was exactly why they came here. He quietly slipped from his sleeping bag, careful not to wake Helena beside him. Across the tent, Lily had somehow managed to turn completely sideways during the night. One foot poked from the end of her sleeping bag while one hand still clutched the smooth pine cone she'd insisted on sleeping with. Tim couldn't help smiling. Some treasures were simply too important to put down. Timmy remained sound asleep, snoring softly enough that only someone inside the tent would notice. Near the entrance, Odin lifted his head. The German shepherd's ears perked immediately. "Morning, buddy." Odin stood, stretched from nose to tail, then gave himself a vigorous shake before waiting patiently by the tent flap. Tim unzipped the door. Cold mountain air spilled inside. Outside, dawn was only beginning. A blanket of pale fog drifted across the lake, hiding the opposite shoreline almost completely. The surrounding mountains appeared as dark silhouettes against a sky slowly changing from deep blue to soft orange. Tiny beads of dew covered every blade of grass. Tim stepped into the cool morning and took a long, slow breath. Pine. Fresh water. Wood smoke lingering from campfires that had burned low hours earlier. There wasn't another place on Earth quite like it. Odin padded quietly around the campsite, performing what Tim jokingly called his morning security patrol. He sniffed the picnic table. Inspected the fire ring. Checked the cooler. Walked the edge of camp. Everything appeared exactly as it should. Tim knelt beside the fire ring and rebuilt yesterday's fire. Dry needles. Small twigs. Kindling. One match. Within moments, orange flames crackled softly between the logs. He filled the battered enamel coffee pot and rested it over the fire. Soon the familiar aroma of fresh coffee began replacing the scent of cold ashes. He settled into his folding chair. The world still belonged to dawn. Across the lake, the fog shifted gently with the breeze. For just a second. Tim frowned. Something moved. Far away. Almost impossible to make out through the mist. A dark shape emerged briefly near the opposite shoreline. Someone walking. Probably another camper. He watched for another few seconds. The figure disappeared behind a stand of evergreens. Morning hike. Couldn't blame them. If he didn't have coffee to wait for, he'd probably be hiking too. A twig snapped behind him. Odin. The shepherd wasn't looking at Tim anymore. He stood perfectly still near the edge of camp. Head high. Ears forward. His body had become rigid. Tim followed his gaze. The trees. Nothing. Probably a squirrel. Or deer. Odin stayed frozen another few seconds before relaxing almost instantly. His tail began wagging again. False alarm. Tim smiled. You almost had me. The dog wandered back toward the fire and lay down beside the warmth. Steam began curling from the coffee pot. The first rays of sunlight finally crested the eastern ridge. Golden light spilled through the trees, burning away patches of mist that hovered over the lake. As visibility improved, Tim glanced back toward the opposite shore. The figure was gone. He shrugged. Whoever it had been was probably already back on a trail. The campground itself remained unusually quiet. Yesterday afternoon he'd noticed nearly a dozen occupied campsites. This morning only a few wisps of smoke rose through the trees. Maybe everyone was sleeping in. Not everyone woke before sunrise like he did. The zipper behind him opened. Helena stepped outside wrapped in a blanket, rubbing sleep from her eyes. You started the coffee without me. Tradition. She smiled and kissed his cheek before settling into the chair beside him. For several minutes they simply watched the sunrise. The lake transformed from dull gray into shimmering gold. Birds flitted between branches overhead. A fish jumped somewhere near the middle of the lake, leaving expanding circles across the otherwise perfect reflection. Beautiful. Tim nodded. I don't think I've ever seen it this calm. Helena noticed Odin. He's quiet this morning. Probably tired from yesterday. Maybe. She scratched behind the shepherd's ears. He leaned into her hand before suddenly lifting his head again. His ears twitched. This time there was no growl. Just quiet attention. Tim looked toward the forest. Hear something? Nothing. The woods stood perfectly still. A few moments later Odin relaxed again and rested his head on his paws. Helena smiled. Guess it wasn't important. Guess not. Far away, almost too distant to hear, a faint sound drifted across the mountains. A helicopter. Tim looked toward the southern horizon. The aircraft appeared briefly above the treeline before disappearing behind a distant ridge. Search and rescue? Helena asked. Maybe. Or the Forest Service. Fire Patrol. Could be. Neither gave it another thought. High above the mountains, helicopters weren't uncommon. Tim reached for the coffee pot and carefully poured 2 steaming mugs. He handed one to Helena. Here's to another perfect day. She smiled warmly. I'll drink to that. Neither of them noticed the flock of crows suddenly bursting from the forest across the lake. Nor did they see, hidden among the retreating morning fog, another lone figure stumbling slowly along the distant shoreline before vanishing once again into the trees. It was too far away to recognize. Too far away to understand. For now, it was simply another strange moment in an otherwise beautiful morning. The smell of bacon finally woke Timmy. His nose twitched before either eye opened. Seriously? Tim laughed as he turned another strip over in the cast-iron skillet. Seriously. Timmy sat upright inside the tent, blinking against the morning light. You did that on purpose. Absolutely. It's impossible to sleep through bacon. Helena smiled from the camp table where she mixed pancake batter. Your father has been weaponizing breakfast for years. It works every time. A muffled voice came from the other side of the tent. I smelled it too. Lily emerged with her hair sticking in every direction imaginable, still clutching yesterday's pine cone. Morning. Morning, sleepyhead. She looked around the campsite. Where's Odin? Tim glanced toward the trees. Over there. The German shepherd stood just beyond the edge of the campsite. Not wandering. Watching. His ears were pointed toward the forest. His tail hung low, not tucked, but unusually still. Odin. The dog's head turned immediately. Come here. He hesitated. Only for a second. Then trotted back into camp. Tim scratched behind his ears. Find something interesting? Odin sniffed Tim's hand before looking back toward the woods again. Helena noticed. He's been doing that all morning. Probably smelled a deer. Or a bear. Tim nodded. Most likely. The mountains belonged to wildlife long before people started camping here. Timmy stretched as he stepped outside. I'd rather it be deer. Me too. Lily looked toward the forest. Can we see one today? Maybe. Just remember. We look at them. We don't walk toward them. I know. She smiled. I remember. Breakfast came together quickly. Bacon crackled. Pancakes browned perfectly on the griddle. Fresh coffee steamed from enamel mugs. The family gathered around the picnic table while the morning sun filtered through the pine branches overhead. Tim took a bite of pancake and sighed happily. Worth waking up early. Everything tastes better outside. Helena pointed her fork toward him. You say that every trip. Because it's true every trip. Lily looked thoughtfully at her pancake. I think syrup tastes happier outside. Timmy laughed. That's actually kind of adorable. She shrugged. It's true. A breeze drifted through camp, carrying the scent of pine and fresh water. For several peaceful minutes, the only sounds were birds singing and quiet conversation. Then, a sharp bark echoed somewhere across the lake. Another answered. Then another. Tim paused. That's a lot of dogs. Helena listened. Someone must have brought a few. Maybe. The barking stopped as suddenly as it had started. Silence settled once again. Tim finished his coffee. Weird. What? Dogs usually keep going once one starts. Probably saw wildlife. Timmy nodded. Makes sense. The explanation satisfied everyone. Mostly. Odin, however, had stopped eating. His breakfast still sat half-finished in the bowl beside the picnic table. Tim frowned. That's unusual. The shepherd almost never left food behind. Everything okay, buddy? Odin glanced toward the trees again. His ears rotated independently, searching. Then he slowly walked away from the bowl. Helena looked over. He's really acting different. Tim stood and carried the bowl toward him. Come on. Breakfast. Odin reluctantly took a few bites before stopping again. Tim rubbed his neck. Maybe he's just tired. Big day yesterday. Could be. Still. It wasn't like him. The family cleaned up breakfast together. Lily carefully stacked plates while Timmy rinsed cookware at the water spigot. Tim wiped down the picnic table before looking toward the lake. The fog had completely disappeared. The opposite shoreline stood clear in the morning light. He paused. Was that? Near a small rocky point almost half a mile away, a lone person stood at the water's edge. Too far to identify. The figure never seemed to move. Just stood there. Tim watched for nearly 30 seconds. Fishing maybe. He couldn't see a rod. Photographer? Bird watcher? The person suddenly turned. Not smoothly. More like several awkward movements stitched together. Tim narrowed his eyes. Probably climbing over rocks. The distance made it hard to tell. He looked away for only a moment as Lily tugged on his sleeve. Dad. Can we hike to the waterfall today? Maybe after lunch. Really? If everyone still has energy. Yes. She ran to tell Timmy the good news. When Tim looked back across the lake, the figure was gone. He scanned the shoreline. Nothing. Odd. Helena noticed him staring. Everything okay? Yeah. Thought I saw somebody fishing across the lake. Lose them? Guess so. She smiled. Pretty big lake. Easy to disappear into the trees. True. A gust of wind suddenly swept through the campground. The tops of the pines swayed together with a long whispering sound. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a flock of birds exploded into the air all at once. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. They circled briefly above the trees before flying north. Timmy watched them. That's a lot of birds. Tim nodded. Something probably spooked them. Bear? Maybe. The explanation made sense. It always had. Yet Odin stood beside Tim with the fur along his shoulders slightly raised. Not growling. Not barking. just staring into the forest beyond the campground. Waiting. Watching. As if he could hear something the rest of them couldn't. Tim rested a reassuring hand on the shepherd's neck. "You're making mountains out of molehills, buddy." Odin didn't look away from the trees. Not even once. By mid-morning, the sun had chased away the last of the cool mountain air. The campground had slowly come to life. A few children rode bicycles along the gravel road. Someone split firewood several campsites away, the rhythmic thud of an axe echoing through the trees. The smell of breakfast still lingered in the air. Tim tightened the straps on his small hiking pack before slipping it over his shoulders. Water bottles? Check. First aid kit? Check. Trail snacks? Check. Helena zipped her own backpack. Sunscreen? Packed. Bug spray? Packed. Lily held up her tiny backpack proudly. Fruit snacks? Packed. Tim smiled. The essentials. Exactly. Timmy adjusted the baseball cap on his head. How long's the hike? About 2 miles each way. Easy enough. Mostly. Mostly? There's one steep section. Lily groaned dramatically. Why are all the pretty places uphill? Tim laughed. Because if they were easy to reach, they'd be crowded. She thought about it for a moment. I guess that's fair. Odin danced excitedly near the truck as soon as Tim picked up his leash. The shepherd knew exactly what hiking boots and backpacks meant. Adventure. Tim clipped the leash to Odin's collar. Ready? Odin answered by pulling toward the trailhead. I'll take that as a yes. The trail began just beyond the campground, winding through towering ponderosa pines before gradually climbing the mountainside. The forest floor was blanketed with soft pine needles that muffled every footstep. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the canopy, creating shifting patches of warmth along the trail. Lily walked ahead, stopping every few minutes to examine something new. A bright orange mushroom. A feather tucked beneath a fallen log. Tiny blue flowers growing beside the path. She seemed fascinated by everything. Tim never hurried her. Curiosity deserved time. Timmy fell into step beside his father. You used to carry me on this trail. When your legs got tired. I don't remember. You were about 5. You insisted you could hike the whole thing yourself. Did I? You made it almost halfway. Then you decided my shoulders looked more comfortable. Timmy smiled. Sounds about right. A gentle breeze stirred the treetops overhead. Somewhere off in the distance, a woodpecker hammered against a dead tree. The forest felt alive. Comfortably alive. They rounded a bend where the trees opened briefly onto a rocky overlook. Below them, the lake shimmered beneath the morning sun. From this height, the campground looked tiny. Colored tents dotted the shoreline like scattered confetti. Helena stopped. Still worth it. Every time. Tim nodded. Best view on the trail. Lily climbed onto a large boulder. I'm queen of the mountain. Long may you reign. She bowed dramatically. Thank you, loyal subjects. Timmy rolled his eyes. She's going to be impossible all day. Probably. The family lingered for a few minutes before continuing. The trail narrowed as it climbed along the side of the ridge. To their left, the forest stretched for miles. To their right, the mountain rose steeply, covered in granite outcroppings and ancient evergreens. Tim noticed Odin slowing. The shepherd's nose remained close to the ground. His pace became deliberate. He sniffed one spot. Then another. What did you find? Odin didn't respond. He continued following an invisible scent that crossed the trail before disappearing downhill into the trees. Deer. Tim guessed. Maybe elk. Odin eventually lost interest and trotted ahead again. About 20 minutes later, they reached another clearing. This one overlooked an old logging road that snaked through the valley nearly half a mile away. Nature had begun reclaiming it years ago. Small saplings grew through cracks in the gravel. Grass pushed between the faded tire tracks. Tim leaned against a weathered fence post. That road used to haul timber decades ago. Nobody uses it anymore? Forest Service sometimes. Not often. Timmy shaded his eyes. Someone's down there. Tim followed his gaze. A lone figure walked along the abandoned road. Far too distant to make out any details. Probably another hiker. The person moved slowly. Very slowly. Then stopped. They stood perfectly still. Lily squinted. Are they looking for something? Maybe. The figure suddenly lurched forward several uneven steps. Not quite stumbling. Not quite walking. Almost as though they couldn't decide where to place their feet. Tim frowned. Must have twisted an ankle. Helena watched quietly. Should we check on them? Too far away to help from here. Besides. Tim looked toward the logging road again. The figure had disappeared behind a cluster of young pines. Could have been anyone. Hunter. Camper. Someone tired from hiking. He shrugged. Hopefully they're okay. A deep thumping sound rolled faintly across the valley. Whump. 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 Tim looked skyward. A helicopter emerged from behind the western ridge. It flew lower than he expected, following the valley instead of crossing over the peaks. Its dark silhouette passed directly above the old logging road before continuing south. Search and rescue again? Helena asked. Maybe. Or someone got lost. The helicopter never slowed. Within a minute it disappeared behind another mountain. Its sound lingered long after it was gone. Strange. Timmy said. What's strange? Usually they fly higher. Tim shrugged. Depends what they're doing. Probably nothing. They resumed hiking. The trail climbed another quarter-mile before bending toward the waterfall. As they disappeared beneath the trees, none of them noticed that the lone figure had emerged from the woods again. It stood alone in the middle of the abandoned logging road. Motionless. Watching nothing. Waiting for no one. Then, after several long moments, it slowly wandered into the forest once more. The sound reached them long before the waterfall came into view. At first it was only a faint murmur beneath the birdsong. With every step, it grew louder. A steady rush of water echoing through the trees. Lily smiled. We're close. Tim nodded. Very close. The trail curved around a cluster of enormous boulders before opening into a wide clearing. A waterfall spilled nearly 40 feet over a granite cliff, crashing into a crystal-clear pool below before continuing downhill as a fast-moving creek toward the lake. Mist drifted through the air, cooling everything it touched. Sunlight caught the spray, painting a faint rainbow across the rocks. Lily stopped in her tracks. It's beautiful. Helena smiled. Pictures never do it justice. They found a flat stretch of rock overlooking the pool and set down their backpacks. Tim removed his hat and wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. Lunch? The answer came from everyone at once. Yes. Helena unpacked sandwiches she'd prepared before leaving camp. Turkey. Ham. Cheese. Fresh fruit. A bag of chips. Nothing fancy. Everything delicious. The family settled onto the warm granite while Odin wandered to the edge of the pool for a drink. Tim took a bite of his sandwich and leaned back on his hands. I could stay here all day. Lily already had her shoes off. Can I go in? Tim looked toward the pool. The water was perfectly clear. Large stones covered the bottom, each visible beneath the gently rippling surface. Stay where we can see you. She nodded eagerly. I will. She carefully stepped into the shallow edge. The cold water reached her ankles. She squealed. That's freezing. Timmy laughed. Mountain water. It doesn't warm up much. She took another cautious step before deciding ankle-deep was cold enough. This is plenty. Odin wandered beside her, splashing happily through the shallows. His tail swept water in every direction. Hey! Lily laughed as droplets soaked her shorts. He did that on purpose. Tim grinned. I think you're right. For a while, everything felt perfect. The waterfall drowned out every other sound. The breeze carried cool mist across the rocks. Dragonflies darted above the creek. Even Timmy had put his phone away. There wasn't any signal this high in the mountains anyway. Helena looked toward the valley below. You know, I haven't thought about work once. That's the goal. Think they'll survive without us? Barely. Tim chuckled. We'll try not to feel guilty. A sudden movement caught Tim's eye. Far below, where the creek widened before feeding into the lake, something drifted slowly with the current. At first he assumed it was a log. Then sunlight reflected off aluminum. A canoe. He sat up. That's odd. Helena followed his gaze. What is? Down there. She shaded her eyes. Looks like a canoe. Nobody in it. The small aluminum canoe drifted lazily around a bend, turning sideways as the current carried it toward the open water. No paddles were visible. No life jackets. No one swimming nearby. Tim watched quietly. Think it came loose? Probably. Someone forgot to tie it off. Makes sense. Still. He expected to hear someone calling after it. Running along the bank. Something. Instead there was only the waterfall. Within another minute the canoe drifted behind a stand of trees and disappeared from sight. Tim shrugged. Someone's having a bad day. Timmy nodded. I'd hate to explain that one. Lunch continued. Lily proudly presented a smooth green stone she'd found beneath the water. Look. Heart-shaped. Tim examined it. You're right. Lucky rock. She slipped it carefully into the small pouch on her backpack. Collection's getting heavy. Worth it. A raven suddenly landed high in a nearby pine. It gave one loud croak. Then another. Within moments, 3 more ravens appeared from deeper in the forest. They settled silently in neighboring branches. Tim watched them. That's unusual. Helena looked up. What? Ravens usually don't gather around people. Maybe somebody's cooking nearby. Maybe. One of the birds suddenly took flight. The others followed almost immediately. They disappeared down the valley. Odin watched them go. Instead of returning to Lily, he walked several yards away from the family. His posture changed again. Rigid. Alert. He stared toward the dense forest downstream. Odin. The shepherd didn't move. Tim walked over. What you got? The dog sniffed the air repeatedly. Then gave a low whine. Not a growl. Not fear. More like uncertainty. Tim scanned the trees. Nothing. Just shadows beneath the pines. Probably caught the scent of a bear. He rested a hand on Odin's shoulder. We'll give him space if he's around. The dog slowly relaxed. A moment later, he returned to the family as though nothing had happened. Tim looked toward the forest one last time. The trees stood perfectly still. The only movement came from leaves dancing gently in the breeze. Then, barely audible beneath the roar of the waterfall, a distant sound echoed through the valley. A scream. It was impossible to tell where it came from. High on another ridge. Across the lake. Miles away. The waterfall swallowed most of it before it reached them. Tim paused. Did you hear? Hear what? Helena asked. He listened. Nothing. Just rushing water. Never mind. Probably somebody yelling from another trail. Timmy nodded. People do that all the time around lakes. Voices carry forever. You're probably right. It made perfect sense. It always did. The family packed up their lunch and shouldered their backpacks once more. As they disappeared back into the forest, the waterfall continued its endless roar. Far below, hidden by the trees along the creek, the empty canoe finally caught against a fallen log. It rocked gently in the current. No one came looking for it. The hike back from the waterfall followed a different trail. According to the weathered map posted near the falls, it would loop around the northern side of the mountain before reconnecting with the main path closer to the campground. Tim folded the map and slipped it into his pocket. Adds about half a mile. Anyone mind? Timmy shrugged. More hiking. Lily grinned. More things to find. Helena smiled. Sounds perfect. The trail wound beneath towering cedars where the forest grew noticeably thicker. Sunlight barely reached the ground. The temperature dropped several degrees beneath the dense canopy. The air smelled of damp moss and rich earth. Every footstep was softened by years of fallen needles and leaves. Lily slowed beside a rotting log covered in emerald green moss. Look at this. Tiny mushrooms no bigger than her thumbnail clustered along its side. They look like fairy umbrellas. Tim crouched beside her. Nature's pretty amazing. Can I touch them? You can look. Better to leave them where they belong. She nodded. Okay. Timmy stepped around a large boulder and looked down the trail. I haven't seen anybody in a while. Tim realized he was right. Normally, this trail saw a steady trickle of hikers. Families. Couples. Photographers. Today. Nothing. Kind of nice. Helena said. Feels like we've got the whole mountain. Tim smiled. Hard to complain about that. Still. It was quieter than he remembered. Even the birds seemed fewer beneath the thick trees. A sudden rustling came from somewhere downhill. Odin stopped instantly. The German shepherd's ears stood tall. His body stiffened. The rustling grew louder. Branches snapped. Lily instinctively stepped closer to Helena. Bear? She whispered. Tim quietly raised a hand. Stay here. The sound continued for another few seconds. Then, 3 deer burst from the underbrush. A large doe followed by 2 nearly grown fawns raced across the trail without slowing. Their eyes were wide. Their breathing heavy. Within seconds they disappeared uphill into the forest. Everyone stood quietly. Tim frowned. They seemed in a hurry. Timmy watched where they'd vanished. Think something scared them? Could have been anything. Bear. Cougar. Hunter. The explanation came easily. Yet something about the way they'd been running lingered in Tim's thoughts. It wasn't the relaxed bounding of startled deer. It looked desperate. Odin continued staring into the trees they'd come from. Come on, buddy. The shepherd hesitated before reluctantly following. About 15 minutes later, the forest began opening again. The trail crossed an old wooden bridge spanning a narrow creek. The bridge creaked pleasantly beneath their boots. Water rushed over smooth stones below. Lily leaned over the railing. Fish. Several tiny trout darted between the rocks. She smiled. They're so little. Give them a few years. Tim said. They'll be dinner-sized. She giggled. Poor fish. Beyond the bridge, the trail passed an old picnic area. Weathered wooden tables sat beneath the trees. A rusted charcoal grill leaned slightly to one side. Tim recognized it immediately. We used to stop here when I was a kid. Really? Timmy asked. Every trip. Your grandfather always insisted this was the best lunch spot. Looks abandoned. Helena observed. It did. One picnic table still held a deck of playing cards scattered across its surface. A folding camp chair had tipped onto its side. Nearby, a blue backpack rested against a tree. Tim stopped. That's odd. Timmy looked around. Maybe somebody's hiking nearby. Probably. Tim walked over. The backpack sat unzipped. A water bottle rested beside it. Half full. He looked toward the surrounding woods. Hello? His voice echoed between the trees. No answer. Anyone here? Silence. Lily looked uneasy. Did they forget it? Maybe. Helena frowned. People don't usually forget backpacks. Tim nodded slowly. No. They usually don't. He considered it for another moment. Maybe someone went down to the creek. Or needed help carrying something. We'll leave it. If someone's coming back, they'll be glad it's still here. Made sense. It had to. As they continued down the trail, Tim glanced over his shoulder one final time. The abandoned picnic area disappeared behind the trees. Something about it bothered him. He couldn't quite explain why. The forest grew brighter as they neared the campground. Voices drifted faintly through the trees. Someone laughed. A dog barked once. Normal sounds. Comforting sounds. Then Odin stopped again. This time he didn't look into the forest. He looked back the way they'd come. His ears stood forward. A low rumble vibrated deep in his chest. Not loud. Barely more than a warning. Tim followed his gaze. Nothing. The trail behind them remained empty. Sunlight filtered lazily through the branches. Leaves swayed gently in the breeze. Whatever had caught Odin's attention was gone. Or hidden. Tim rested a reassuring hand on the dog's shoulder. Let's get back to camp. Odin looked at him for another long second before finally turning away. The shepherd followed. But every few yards, he looked back down the trail as though expecting something to emerge from between the trees. It never did. At least. Not while they were watching. The campground was busier when they returned. Children laughed near the swimming beach. A father tossed a football with his son across an open patch of grass. Someone had started grilling burgers, the smoky aroma drifting lazily through the afternoon air. For a few minutes, the strange uneasiness of the hike faded into the background. Home for the afternoon. Tim announced as he dropped his backpack beside the picnic table. My feet vote for a nap. Timmy stretched dramatically. Seconded. Lily immediately shook her head. I vote no naps. Nobody asked you. She stuck her tongue out. Helena laughed as she unpacked the remaining snacks from lunch. How about a compromise? Quiet time. Books. Cards. Relax. Nobody has to sleep. Lily considered it. Okay. But I'm still not taking a nap. Tim poured fresh water into Odin's bowl. The German shepherd drank deeply before lying beside the picnic table. For the first time all day, he appeared content. Tim smiled. Finally settling down? Odin sighed happily. Much better. The afternoon drifted by peacefully. Tim and Timmy played several hands of cribbage while Helena read beneath the shade of a towering pine. Lily sat nearby, carefully sketching the waterfall in a small notebook. Every so often she looked up at the real mountains before adding another line to her drawing. It's getting better. She proudly held it up. Tim studied the page. I think you've got my artistic talent. That's either a compliment or an insult. Little of both. She laughed. A cool breeze swept through camp. Several nearby campers looked toward the sky at the same time. Tim followed their gaze. Another helicopter. This one was noticeably lower than the last. Its deep rhythmic blades echoed through the valley long before it came into view. Whump. 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 The aircraft appeared over the treetops from the north. Dark green. Larger than the one they'd seen earlier. It wasn't flying toward the mountains. It was following the lake. Slowly. Almost deliberately. Everyone in the campground paused to watch. That's pretty low. One nearby camper remarked. Search and rescue? His wife shrugged. Probably. Tim watched the helicopter continue south. Instead of disappearing immediately, it circled once over the far shoreline. Then again. Tim frowned. Looking for somebody? Helena asked quietly. Maybe. Lost hiker. Missing boat. Hard to say. The helicopter banked sharply before disappearing beyond the southern ridge. Its engine noise slowly faded into silence. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Then the campground resumed as though nothing had happened. Kids returned to playing. Camp chairs creaked. Someone laughed. Life continued. Tim shuffled the cards. Your deal. Timmy picked them up. Think they found whoever they were looking for? Hopefully. Helena looked thoughtfully toward the mountains. You'd think we'd hear about it. Maybe somebody at the ranger station knows. Probably. Not much else to do about it. The game continued. Halfway through the next hand, Odin abruptly lifted his head. His ears pointed toward the campground entrance. Tim noticed immediately. What is it? The shepherd stood. His body remained relaxed. But his attention never wavered. A white pickup truck slowly rolled down the gravel road. The driver stopped briefly at several campsites. Speaking with people. Pointing toward the campground office. Tim watched as the truck finally pulled away. Wonder what that was about. A camper from across the road walked back to his family. Passing through, he called. Apparently the ranger wants everyone to make sure they've signed in properly. Tim blinked. That's different. Helena looked up from her book. They don't normally do that? Not that I remember. Maybe they're checking permits. Fire restrictions. Bear activity. Could be anything. The explanation seemed reasonable enough. By late afternoon, long shadows stretched between the trees. The heat softened. A pleasant coolness returned to the mountain air. Tim decided to gather more firewood before dinner. Need a volunteer. Timmy stood. I'll help. The two followed a permitted collection area just beyond the campground. Nothing far. Just enough to keep the evening fire going. As they gathered fallen branches, Tim paused. Smell that? Timmy sniffed the air. Smoke. Campfire. No. Tim pointed toward the western horizon. Above the distant mountains, a thin gray column rose into the sky. Too narrow for a forest fire. Too steady for someone's campfire. Probably somebody burning slash. Timmy suggested. Could be. Though this time of year? Maybe the Forest Service. Tim wasn't entirely convinced. Still, there were plenty of ordinary explanations. He picked up another fallen branch. By the time their arms were full of wood, the smoke had thinned until it was nearly impossible to see. Back at camp, Lily excitedly ran over. "Dad. Look." She held up a smooth piece of driftwood she'd found near the shore. "It looks like a dragon." Tim turned it over in his hands. "I think you're right. Can I keep it?" "Sure. As long as no dragons come looking for it." She giggled. Dinner passed peacefully beneath streaks of orange and gold painted across the evening sky. The lake reflected every color like polished glass. It should have been one of those perfect mountain evenings people remembered forever. Yet as darkness slowly crept between the trees, Tim found himself glancing more often toward the distant ridgeline where the smoke had been. He wasn't worried. Not exactly. Just curious. Across the lake, too far for anyone in the campground to notice, a faint flicker of orange briefly appeared through the trees. Then another. Then darkness swallowed them both. No one around the campfire ever looked in that direction. Dinner dishes were washed and stacked neatly beside the picnic table. The last light of the day painted the mountains in deep shades of orange and purple. A gentle breeze rippled across the lake, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke through the campground. Tim leaned back in his folding chair and stretched. "Perfect day." Timmy nodded. "My legs are definitely going to feel that hike tomorrow." "That's how you know it was a good one." Lily looked up from the dragon-shaped driftwood she'd been pretending could fly. "Can we walk down to the lake?" Helena smiled. "Just for a little while. Before it gets dark." The family made their way down the short trail leading to the shoreline. Odin trotted happily ahead, nose busy investigating every familiar scent along the path. The beach was quieter than it had been that morning. A handful of campers skipped stones across the calm water. 2 teenagers cast fishing lines from the small dock. Several empty lawn chairs faced the lake, abandoned for the evening while their owners prepared dinner. Tim picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the water. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not bad. Timmy grinned. "Show off." "Your turn." Timmy's first throw dove straight into the lake with a loud splash. Lily burst into laughter. That fish didn't even have time to move. He bowed dramatically. "I was aiming for that one." "Sure you were." The family laughed together. For a while, the uneasiness that had lingered throughout the day seemed to disappear. The lake was calm. The mountains stood silent against the darkening sky. Everything felt exactly as it should. Helena slipped her hand into Tim's. "I needed this trip." "Me too. Sometimes it's nice to disappear for a couple of days. No phones. No work. No schedules. Just us." Tim squeezed her hand gently. "We should do it more often." A voice interrupted their quiet moment. "Excuse me." They turned. An older man wearing a faded fishing vest approached with an empty tackle box in one hand. "Evening." "Evening." The man smiled politely. "You folks been here long?" "Since yesterday afternoon." He nodded thoughtfully. "You happen to see a little aluminum boat anywhere?" Tim exchanged a quick glance with Helena. "Actually, we saw an empty canoe drifting down the creek near the waterfall today." The man's eyebrows rose. "Empty?" "Nobody in it. Just floating with the current." "Huh." He scratched his chin. "Probably not mine then. Mine's tied up over on the north shore. Just figured I'd ask. Hope you find it." "Appreciate it." The fisherman tipped his hat before continuing down the shoreline. Tim watched him disappear. Funny coincidence, Helena said. Yeah. Probably somebody else's canoe. Has to be. The sun dipped lower behind the mountains. Camp lights slowly began flickering on around the shoreline. As the family walked back through the campground, Tim noticed something odd. 3 neighboring campsites sat completely empty. Not simply quiet. Vacant. A fire ring still held glowing coals. 2 camping chairs remained unfolded around it. A lantern hung from a shepherd's hook, gently swaying in the breeze. Yet there wasn't a single person in sight. That's strange. Helena followed his gaze. Maybe they all went into town. Together? Tim asked. Maybe. Tim looked around. Several vehicles were missing. That explained it. Probably grocery run. Ice. Supplies. Perfectly reasonable. Still. People usually packed food away before leaving. A cooler sat open beneath one of the tables. Another campsite had towels hanging from a clothesline. It looked as though everyone had simply walked away. Lily pointed toward a stuffed teddy bear sitting alone in a camp chair. Somebody forgot their bear. I'm sure they'll be back. Tim said. Let's leave him where he is. She nodded. Okay. As they continued walking, Odin slowed. His ears stood forward. His tail lowered slightly. The shepherd quietly moved between Lily and the tree line without anyone asking him to. Tim noticed immediately. Protecting his girl? Good dog. Odin never looked away from the woods. A faint rustling drifted from somewhere beyond the campground. Probably a squirrel. Tim thought. Maybe another deer. The sound stopped. Everything became still again. Then, far beyond the trees, someone appeared briefly on a narrow trail that led toward the campground entrance. The figure stumbled awkwardly. Stopped. Turned. Then wandered back into the forest. Tim only caught a glimpse before the trees swallowed them. Probably another camper trying to find their site. Helena asked. Think someone got turned around? Could be. It's easy to lose the trail after dark. The explanation settled comfortably in everyone's mind. By the time they returned to their campsite, the first stars had begun appearing overhead. Tim built up the evening fire while Helena prepared hot chocolate. Lily roasted marshmallows with absolute determination. Timmy tried, and failed, to toast one without setting it on fire. Again? Helena laughed. I like them crispy. You like them charcoal. There's a difference. The family settled into comfortable silence, watching sparks drift into the clear night sky. Somewhere across the lake, a lone coyote began to howl. Another answered. Then another. The calls echoed from ridge to ridge before fading into the darkness. Beautiful. Helena whispered. Tim nodded. The mountains always had their own music after sunset. Odin, however, wasn't listening to the coyotes. He sat beside Lily's chair. Eyes fixed beyond the reach of the firelight. Watching the darkness beneath the trees. Waiting. As though he expected something to step into the glow. Nothing ever did. At least. Not tonight. The campground was unusually quiet the next morning. Tim noticed it before he even climbed out of the tent. Normally, mornings at Cedar Ridge came with the sounds of camp stoves hissing, coffee percolating, children laughing, and neighbors greeting one another across campsites. This morning, the birds seemed louder than the people. He unzipped the tent and stepped into the cool mountain air. The sky was perfectly clear. Mist hovered over the lake. Everything looked beautiful. Everything felt subdued. Odin stretched before beginning his usual patrol around the campsite. Unlike the previous morning, he didn't wander far. He circled once. Paused. Looked toward the campground road. Then returned to Tim's side. You're staying close today? The shepherd wagged his tail once but remained nearby. Tim started the campfire and set the coffee pot over the flames. Before long Helena joined him, wrapping a sweatshirt around herself against the morning chill. Cold enough for another cup. Always. She accepted the steaming mug with a grateful smile. For several minutes they simply watched the sunrise paint the mountains gold. Then Helena glanced toward the neighboring campsites. Didn't those people leave yesterday? Tim looked over. The 3 campsites they'd noticed the evening before were still empty. Their chairs remained outside. A lantern still hung from its hook. One picnic table still held an unfinished deck of cards exactly where they'd been left. Strange. He took another sip of coffee. Maybe they extended whatever they went to do. Helena frowned. Overnight? Could have rented a cabin. Gone into town. Family emergency. There are plenty of reasons. True. Still. Neither of them sounded convinced. Timmy stumbled from the tent a few minutes later, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Morning. Morning. He poured himself a cup of hot chocolate instead of coffee. As he looked around the campground, he tilted his head. Feels quieter. Tim nodded. I was thinking the same thing. Lily emerged last, still carrying her dragon-shaped driftwood. Morning, everyone. Morning. She yawned dramatically before wandering over to pet Odin. The German shepherd happily accepted the attention but kept glancing toward the campground entrance. Tim noticed again. Something definitely has his attention. After breakfast, the family decided to take a slow walk around the campground before choosing what to do for the day. The gravel roads wound between dozens of campsites nestled among towering pines. Most still looked occupied. Smoke rose from breakfast fires. Children played tag between trees. Someone strummed an acoustic guitar outside their camper. Everything appeared normal. Until they reached the northern loop. Tim stopped walking. Almost half the sites on this side sat empty. Not cleaned out. Abandoned. A bicycle leaned against a picnic table. A hammock swayed gently between 2 trees. A coffee mug still rested beside an extinguished fire ring. No people. No vehicles. No movement. Timmy looked around. That's weird. Helena nodded slowly. It wasn't like this yesterday. No. It wasn't. A campground host drove slowly past in a small utility cart. Morning, folks. Morning. Tim raised a hand. Busy weekend? The older man offered a tired smile. Actually. Quite a few folks packed up early. Really? Yep. Couldn't tell you why. Just one after another this morning. Guess everybody suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. He chuckled softly, though it sounded forced. Have a good one. You too. The utility cart continued down the road. Tim watched it disappear. See? Helena said. Nothing strange. People just heading home. Makes sense. It did. Even if it felt oddly sudden. As they continued walking, a ranger truck rolled slowly into the campground. It stopped beside the campground office. 2 uniformed rangers stepped out. Neither appeared hurried. They spoke quietly with the campground host before unfolding a large paper map across the hood of the truck. Tim couldn't hear their conversation. One ranger pointed towards several roads leading out of the campground. The other nodded while making notes. Timmy watched curiously. Wonder what that's about. Probably trail maintenance. Fire conditions. Maybe someone reported a bear. Tim answered. all reasonable possibilities. The rangers folded the map and drove away only a few minutes later. The campground host stood watching until the truck disappeared from view. Then he slowly returned to his office. As the family made their way back toward their own campsite, Odin suddenly froze. His ears stood rigid. His eyes locked onto the tree line bordering the campground. A faint breeze carried through the pines. Leaves rustled softly. Nothing else moved. Odin gave a quiet whine. Tim stepped beside him. "What is it?" The shepherd sniffed the air several times. Then, almost reluctantly, relaxed. "Probably picked up another deer," Helena suggested. "Probably," Tim agreed. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that Odin had been trying to warn them about something for nearly 2 days. The trouble was, whatever it was, the dog never seemed able to find it. As they reached their campsite, Lily suddenly smiled and pointed toward the lake. "Look." A family of ducks glided peacefully across the still water. 6 tiny ducklings paddled closely behind their mother. The sight immediately lifted everyone's spirits. Nature was carrying on exactly as it always had. The mountains were still beautiful. The lake was still calm. And for one more morning, the world still felt safe. Far beyond the campground, hidden by miles of forest and mountains, a thin column of black smoke quietly climbed into the cloudless sky. No one noticed it. By late morning, the sun had warmed the campground enough that jackets were tied around waists and draped over camp chairs. After 2 days of hiking, Helena suggested something simpler. "How about we stay close today?" Nobody objected. Timmy stretched out in one of the folding chairs with a paperback he'd brought but barely touched. "My legs appreciate that idea." Lily was already kneeling near the shoreline with a small bucket, carefully collecting smooth stones. "I'm making a fairy village." Tim smiled. "Out of rocks? And sticks? And pine cones?" She held up a tiny pebble. "This one's the dinner table." "Looks perfect." Tim grabbed his fishing rod from the truck. "I'm going to see if the fish are hungry." "Mind if I come?" Timmy asked. "Not at all." The two walked to the end of the small dock while Helena remained near the campsite, reading beneath the shade of a pine. Odin wandered between everyone, never straying far from the family. Tim baited his hook and cast into the still water. The line landed with barely a ripple. Peace settled over the lake. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. There wasn't any need. Fishing had always been as much about the silence as the fish. Timmy finally broke it. "You think we'll make this a yearly thing?" "Absolutely. Even when you're too old to think hanging out with your parents is cool." Timmy smiled. "I'll probably still come." "Probably?" "Depends. Will there still be bacon?" Tim laughed. "There'll always be bacon." "Good. Then I'm in." A sudden splash erupted farther down the shoreline. Both of them looked. Several trout burst from the water almost simultaneously. Not jumping lazily after insects. Exploding. They scattered in every direction before disappearing beneath the surface again. Tim frowned. "That's unusual. Big fish chasing them?" "Maybe. Could have been an eagle overhead." He glanced upward. The sky was empty. Within moments the lake became calm once more. Neither mentioned it again. Back at the campsite, Lily carefully arranged tiny pine cones around her miniature village. Helena looked over her book. "Who's going to live there?" "Forest mice," she answered without hesitation. "And squirrels. I think the squirrels might argue over property lines." Lily giggled. "Then the mice will be mayors." Problem solved. A shadow swept across the ground. Everyone instinctively looked up. Not a helicopter this time. A flock of birds. Hundreds of them. They flew low over the campground, moving fast. Much faster than migrating birds usually did. The entire flock banked sharply together before disappearing over the eastern ridge. Tim watched until the last bird vanished. Wonder what scared them. Helena closed her book. Maybe a hawk. That's a lot of birds for one hawk, Tim admitted. Odin stood beside the picnic table, watching the direction the birds had gone. His ears remained forward long after the sky was empty again. Around lunchtime, the family decided to walk the shoreline. The lake reflected the afternoon sun like polished glass. Dragonflies skimmed just above the surface. Tiny frogs disappeared into the reeds as Lily approached. She crouched beside the water. They're so tiny. Don't chase them too much. I'm just looking. Tim smiled. I know. Halfway around the shoreline, Odin suddenly stopped. His body stiffened. He looked across the lake toward the dense forest on the opposite shore. Tim followed his gaze. Nothing. Just trees. Odin let out a soft whine. Not frightened. Concerned. Tim rested a hand on the dog's neck. You keep seeing things we don't you? The shepherd didn't move. A loud crack echoed through the forest across the lake. Like a large branch snapping. Everyone looked. Another crack followed. Then silence. Bear. Tim said after a moment. Probably. Maybe an elk. Helena nodded. Big enough to break branches. The explanation fit. It usually did. As they rounded a bend in the shoreline, they nearly walked into an elderly couple packing their camper. Leaving already? Tim asked. The older woman smiled politely. Afraid so. Family called. Need us home sooner than expected. Nothing serious, I hope. We don't think so. Just one of those feelings. She paused, searching for the right words. Felt like we shouldn't stay another night. Her husband chuckled as he loaded another cooler. Probably just your grandmother's intuition. She smiled, though it never quite reached her eyes. Maybe. Either way. Home sounds nice. Safe travels. You too. The family continued walking. Lily skipped ahead, humming quietly to herself. Tim looked back once. The elderly couple worked quickly. Faster than most campers packing up. Maybe they really did have somewhere to be. By mid-afternoon, clouds began gathering over the distant western mountains. Not storm clouds. Thin gray streaks that blurred the horizon. Tim noticed them while cleaning his fishing gear. Smoke again. Helena followed his gaze. Hard to tell from here. Maybe another controlled burn. Could be. Though he couldn't remember seeing controlled burns in midsummer. He shrugged the thought away. The Forest Service knew their business better than he did. Late in the afternoon, a pair of deer wandered quietly along the edge of the campground. Normally, campers would rush for cameras. Today, hardly anyone noticed. The deer paused. Both raised their heads toward the forest. Their ears flicked nervously. Without warning, they bolted. Not away from people. Away from the trees. They sprinted across the campground road, disappearing toward the open shoreline. Tim watched them go. That's the second time we've seen deer running like that. Timmy nodded. Yeah. Kind of weird. Bear must be making the rounds. Probably. It was the simplest answer. And the simplest answers were usually right. As evening approached, the campground grew quieter than it had been the night before. More empty campsites. More vacant parking spaces. More silence between the sounds of everyday camping. Tim added another log to the fire and looked around. Feels like we're getting the place to ourselves. Helena smiled. You always wanted a quieter campground. Guess I got my wish. They laughed together. Across the fire, Odin quietly lifted his head. He stared into the darkening forest beyond the campground. One ear twitched. Then the other. A distant howl echoed through the mountains. Not a coyote. Longer. Lower. It faded almost as quickly as it had begun. Tim listened. Wolf? Maybe. Helena answered. They're making their way back into parts of the northwest. Could have been one. Maybe. Odin remained standing for several more moments before slowly lying back down. He rested his head on his paws. His eyes, however, never left the trees. The campground settled into its final evening with a quietness Tim had never experienced before. Not silence. There were still campfires burning. Still the occasional laugh drifting between the trees. Still children roasting marshmallows beneath strings of lanterns. But there were gaps now. Whole stretches of campsites sat empty. The laughter didn't carry as far. The conversations ended sooner. Even the lake seemed calmer. Tim added another log to the fire. Flames crackled upward, sending sparks dancing into the darkening sky. Helena wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Hard to believe we head home tomorrow. Already. Feels like we just got here. Timmy leaned back in his chair. I wouldn't mind another day. Lily looked up hopefully. Can we stay? Tim smiled. Unfortunately. Real life eventually catches up with vacations. She sighed dramatically. Real life is rude. That earned a laugh from everyone. Even Odin seemed to relax for a few moments, stretching beside Lily's chair while she absent-mindedly scratched behind his ears. Dinner had been simple. Foil packet potatoes. Grilled sausage. Fresh corn. Now dessert consisted of toasted marshmallows and chocolate tucked between graham crackers. Tim examined another perfectly golden marshmallow. This is how it's done? Timmy held up his own. Mine's better. His marshmallow promptly slipped off the roasting stick and landed directly in the fire. Lily burst into laughter. Again. I had it under control. Helena smiled. Sure you did. Tim reached into the bag and handed him another. Last one. No pressure. The evening passed comfortably. Stories drifted from one memory to another. Tim recounted the time Timmy had accidentally fallen into a creek while trying to catch a frog. I was 6. You still screamed. I did not. You absolutely did. Lily laughed so hard she nearly dropped her S-more. Then Helena shared the story of Lily trying to convince everyone that a chipmunk was secretly a forest wizard. He was. Lily insisted. You can't prove he wasn't. Fair point. The stars slowly emerged overhead. One by one. Until the sky was filled with them. Far from the city lights, the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like spilled silver. Tim leaned back. I miss seeing stars like this. We should come every year. Helena said softly. No matter how busy life gets. Promise? Promise. Timmy nodded. Deal. Lily raised her marshmallow stick. Deal. The family tapped their roasting sticks together like glasses in a toast. Odin suddenly lifted his head. His ears stood straight. He stared into the darkness beyond the campground road. Tim noticed immediately. What is it? The shepherd remained perfectly still. Several seconds passed. Then, a distant engine echoed faintly through the mountains. Not unusual. Probably someone driving the forest road. The sound continued. Growing louder. Headlights eventually appeared between the trees near the campground entrance. A sheriff's SUV rolled slowly past. No emergency lights. No siren. Just a steady crawl through the campground. The deputy glanced toward occupied campsites as he drove. Then continued toward the campground office. "That's different," Tim said quietly. "Routine patrol?" Helena suggested. "Probably. Holiday weekends usually bring extra patrols." The explanation fit well enough. A few minutes later, the SUV drove back toward the exit and disappeared into the darkness. The campground became quiet once more. Tim tossed another stick into the fire. "Think we'll beat traffic tomorrow?" "If we leave early enough," Helena replied. "Breakfast. Pack up. On the road by 8. Works for me." Lily frowned. "Do we have to leave that early? If we want bacon at home tomorrow night." She thought about it. "Okay. Worth it." The fire slowly burned lower. Nearby campsites began extinguishing lanterns one by one. Doors to campers closed. Tent zippers echoed softly through the night. The campground was going to sleep. Tim stood and stretched. One last walk before bed. "Anyone coming?" Timmy shook his head. "I'm comfortable." "I'll come," Helena said. Lily yawned. "I'm staying with Odin." The couple wandered slowly toward the shoreline. Moonlight shimmered across the calm water. The opposite shore was little more than a dark silhouette beneath the stars. For several peaceful minutes they simply walked hand in hand. Then, far across the lake, a faint orange glow flickered between the distant trees. It lasted only a second. Then disappeared. "Campfire," Tim guessed. "Probably. Though it seemed much brighter than that." Before either of them could think much more about it, a distant pop echoed across the water. Then another. Then silence. "Fireworks?" Helena asked. "Maybe." Though neither remembered anyone mentioning fireworks this weekend. The sounds didn't repeat. They stood listening for another minute. "Nothing. Let's head back." "Yeah." As they returned to camp, Tim noticed something else. The campground office was still lit. Inside, the campground host spoke quietly with 2 rangers. Maps covered the front counter. One ranger held a handheld radio close to his ear. The conversation appeared serious. But no one seemed panicked. Tim looked for a moment before continuing on. "Probably planning tomorrow. Busy weekend." "Makes sense." Back at camp, Lily was already asleep in her chair, wrapped snugly in a blanket with Odin curled protectively at her feet. Tim gently lifted her into his arms. She barely stirred. "Long day," Helena whispered. "The best kind." They tucked both children into the tent before extinguishing the campfire. Only glowing embers remained. Tim took one final look across the quiet campground. So many empty campsites. So much unexpected silence. Still, he couldn't think of a single reason to worry. Tomorrow would be a long drive home. That was all. He zipped the tent closed. Within minutes, only the sounds of insects and the gentle breeze remained. Hours later, long after every camper had gone to sleep, Odin's eyes opened. He quietly lifted his head. Beyond the campground, somewhere deep within the forest, a single human scream echoed through the mountains. It ended abruptly. Odin stood. His ears strained toward the darkness. He let out a low, uncertain whine. Inside the tent, no one else woke. By sunrise, the family would begin the journey home, completely unaware that the world they had left behind 3 days earlier no longer existed.